Okay, so good morning, everyone. And my name is Sean Francis. I'm the Horticulture Extension Specialist here at the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff. So briefly this morning, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the environmental considerations in a high tunnel. Um, Wanted to look briefly at, well, started by looking a little bit at soil and why soil is important and why we need to manage soil, as well as talk a little bit about those environmental factors, talk a little bit about light and heat, and then just briefly touch on, some irrigation. So this is just to get you started. I had inquired about, the participants today, and I was informed some are still thinking about getting involved in high tunnel operations and some are actually involved. So for some of you who are indeed involved in high tunnel production, this is just, some of this is just refresher stuff for you. For those of you who are beginning or thinking about getting in, you may find some of this useful. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the soil and why is it important to manage the soil. And the soil is actually important because that's what we use in the high tunnels, similar to what we're doing outside in the field. It anchors our plants in place. So without the soil, unless you're using some other medium in there, you know, you really can't grow anything. You need that soil in there to grow. It would provide some of the plant nutrients depending on the quality of your soil that you have in the high tunnel. And it also provides your plants with the water it needs, and we know there's some air in the soil. So, there's this chart I have there that sets out the components of soil. And we know the major components of soil are its physical and chemical properties. And it's also made up of 25% air, 25% of our soil is water. Physical components included, meaning the individual particles and the size of those particles, which is what we refer to as the soil texture, as well as how these particles are arranged, or what we refer to as the soil structure. And then there's the organic matter. Soil is made up of 5% organic matter, which is, we like to refer to organic matter as the glue that holds these particles together. So that's what we have, what we look at when we look at our soil. 45% physical chemical properties, 5% organic matter, we have 25% air, 25% water. Now, why is it important to manage soil? Okay, good. Why is it important to manage soil? And it's important because within a high tunnel, the soil temperature and the soil moisture are usually elevated. And it's very favorable for plant growth because we have warmer temperatures up in there. Maybe depending on the season, our soil would warm up a lot faster than the soil on the outside. So it favors our plant growth, very favorable to plant growth. But the thing is, plant growth, it's not the only thing that it's favorable to. It's also favorable to insect action, and those conditions are also favorable to microbial action. Sometimes all of this or a lot of this can be a good thing, sometimes not such a good thing. One of the other things that it's favorable to is the rapid decay of organic matter. And we know that the organic matter is what we describe as the glue that holds the soil structure in place, that holds these particles together, hence giving the soil its structure. So if we're not adding adequate amounts of organic matter to our soil, to our high tunnel soil, over time, what we have is just a depletion of that soil, a degradation, destruction of that soil. And it's very common for high tunnel type soils or soils in high tunnel structures to have compaction issues. And that's really as a result of destroying the structure of that soil, it becomes easy for it to become compacted. So once we have our high tunnel, we know we have to manage our soils. If not, we have these issues. And what are some of the things to keep in mind as we think about managing our soils? What are some of our goals or broad goals that we want to have in mind? Firstly, we want to build the soil organic matter to approximately 5% or so. 5% decent enough organic matter content for our soils, our high tunnel soils. And we want to do this without creating high nutrient levels, because that leads to a different set of problems. That leads to problems with soil salinity, and those issues, those issues can be really hard to overcome. We also want to protect that soil structure, like I said, because we know once our organic matter is depleted, our soil structure is it's poor. We run into all sorts of problems here. We want to maintain soil moisture. Soil moisture is very critical for plant growth. Crop rotation, we want to always be practicing crop rotation, and this is not just for high tunnel structures. It's a bit more important given that you're utilizing a confined area. So you want to rotate your crops to prevent the accumulation of soil-borne pathogens. We know when you're operating even out in the field, soil rotation is a good cultural practice. We also want to maintain good sanitation. And to maintain good sanitation, you want to always ensure you're disposing of residue from within the tunnel. As you get to the end of a crop, you harvest, you want to make sure that you're throwing all the residue outside. You're not keeping dried and decaying matter from your previous harvest in your high tunnel. It becomes a perfect host for weeds, for diseases. You really want to ensure that you're practicing good sanitation. Now, like I said, if we don't manage our soils, we run into soil compaction issues, and our high tunnel soils are prone to compaction. Compaction from just us walking in there doing whatever it is we're doing. We're just preparing, we're making beds, we're fertilizing, we're setting up irrigation settings, whatever we up and down in there doing, our feet just trafficking on the soil is going to compact those soils. We also suffer compaction from machines. You may have maybe a light tractor. We may think, oh, it's just a light piece of equipment we have up in there. But just from going up and down in there, you're going to compact your soil. Tillage also destroys the mix of large and small particles in the soil, and that affects the structure. The soil structure relates to the structure, how the particles are related together. So you keep tilling in there, constant tilling, you just destroy that mix of large and small particles. Over time, everything is broken down and your soil becomes easily compacted. And you may already be starting off with compacted soil even during the construction phase of your high tunnel. You may have heavy equipment out there, moving soil, bringing in soil, trying to level ground and all of that sort of thing. And that too can help to compact your soil. So what are some of the things that we can do to reduce these compaction issues, hence manage this soil to give us the best quality and the best yields for our crops? One of the things we can do is ensure that we're planting on beds, and it doesn't all have to be raised beds or elevated beds, but if you in the photograph, you actually see lines that are laid out there that indicate, where your bed space is as against where your alley is or where your walkway is. So that's one of the things that you can do. And once you've set up your layout, you want to ensure that you're limiting your traffic to the walkways or the alleyways. So you're not walking on your beds. You're keeping your traffic strictly into those alleyways and those walkways. Now, those beds, once they're set up, they can be kept from season to season, or you can actually remake these beds periodically, maybe at the end of a planting year or planting season, whatever the case may be. You can actually remake these beds. One of the things some operators would do is shift around the positioning of the bed. So maybe one area that was a walkway or alleyway one season is incorporated into a bed space the next season, just so as to keep a rotation and not allow that walkway to be too compacted. The other thing we can do is keep increasing or keep adding organic matter to those soils. Like we said, the organic matter is what helps to improve the quality of the soil. We can add organic matter, using mulches for weed control that you incorporate into the soil at the end of the season. Or we can add compost to those soils. Cover crops is also another good, source of organic matter, depending on what types of cover crops we can use. And cover crops, even used as live plants, if you have good, deep-rooted cover crops, those would help us to alleviate some compaction issues in our high tunnel. Like I said, one of the other issues that affects us in producing in high tunnel is salinity. Now, what is salinity? Salinity is actually the buildup of salts in the soil. Now, where do these salts come from? These salts would come from our fertilizers that are applied to the soil. How do you know if you have some salinity issues in your soil? I have listed a few of the symptoms that you'll notice. You'll see plants stunting, you'll observe these on the leaves, stems, roots, fruits. You will also have dieback, root dieback, where the tips of your roots would burn. Once your root tips are burning, that affects uptake of moisture, it affects uptakes of nutrients and everything. Eventually, your entire plant would die. Then you have leaf burns. You'll notice leaf burns where around the edges of your leaves would begin to dry out, look burned as though it was laid up against heat. And particularly the lower leaves, that'll suffer leaf burns, extensively. And then your plants would wilt. Like I said, once your root tips begin to burn and you have root dieback, it affects the absorption of moisture into those plants. And it's worse in hot, dry climates. So what are some of the things that would cause these salinity issues? Like I said, it's caused by a buildup of salts. So if you're not placing your fertilizer properly, and particularly when you're mixing fertilizer, if you're not mixing that fertilizer properly, and at the end of your mix, you still have a whole lot of the salts that are still not in a soluble form. When you go to put that out into the high tunnel, those salts would remain on the bed there. A lot of times, these fertilizer salts are mainly due to potassium and nitrates, but there's some other elements there too that can cause salinity issues. I know calcium, magnesium, a whole lot of elements can cause salinity issues. If you're having a situation where evapotranspiration is greater than irrigation, which means the rate at which the plants are transpiring water and causing evaporation, if that rate is greater than the amount of in there, you're going to have salinity issues because you need that fertilizer to be absorbed within the irrigation water. Now, if it's so hot that by the time you irrigate, that water is transpired and evaporates out of the soil without the plant really getting to absorb a lot of the fertilizer. The salts is what is going to remain within that soil, and over time it's going to build up to levels that are going to cause your soil to become saline. If you're applying too much fertilizer, if you're applying more fertilizer than your plants can take up, there's always going to be fertilizer left there to build up and cause these salinity issues. As well as if you have a high water table, that causes salinity issues. A lot of times when you have these high rates of evapotranspiration and the soil loses the irrigation water that you apply, the water from the water table would tend to come up to the and roots would help to bring those waters up to the surface. And a lot of times the water lying down there in the water table would contain salts as well. So these are some of the things that we have to be aware of if we want to avoid having issues with salinity. Now, how do we reduce some of these, reduce salinity levels? If you're having issues with high levels of salt in your soil, how do we deal with some of this? How can we reduce it? Well, initially we want to ensure that we're placing our tunnels on well-drained sites, because we want to ensure that once we are applying irrigation water there, that our soil is going to drain properly. So, for instance, if we have issues with salinity and we try to maybe do a flush, say you want to get in there and irrigate, saturate that soil and hope that it leaches the excess salt into the lower profiles of the soil. If you don't have a well-drained soil, that exercise becomes futile. You also want to monitor salt levels using electric conductivity tests during your routine soil sampling. And I remember it was in June of this year, speaking to an operator who had never done a soil test for the soil in the high tunnel. We want to manage our high tunnel soil similar to how we would manage our soils in the field. Because if you don't know the levels of elements that you have in the soil prior to planting, then you're operating in a vacuum in terms of fertilizing. You don't know what's there, you don't know what you need to add. So always ensure that you're taking soil samples and you want to monitor salt levels, ensure you're testing for salt. Do not over-fertilize. Like we said, that was one of the causes of salinity if you're putting too much fertilizer out there. And you want organic sources containing animal manures. Some forms of animal manures are very rich in nitrates, and that's one of the elements that lends to salinity. We can leach the salt downward via irrigation. Like I said, you can come in to attempt to do a flush, and you put that irrigation water on there, and you hope that you leach it down into the lower profiles of the soil, get it beyond the root zone. And one of the things I know a lot of growers would do is whenever they get to the time that they have to change their plastic, when they take the old plastic off, they leave the structure uncovered for a period of time and allow that rain to get in there, and that allows for the leaching action via rainfall. Now, if we can look a little bit at the temperature, our high tunnel temperature, we know if we're not paying attention to the temperature within our high tunnel structures, things cannot go so well. I remember one time, even our high tunnel on the farm, we had some tomatoes in there. It was approaching the summer months, and we had beautiful plant stand, beautiful foliage and everything. They blossomed, but no fruit. It was just too hot for those plants for any fertilization to take place in there. So an environmental factor that restricts plant growth and development the most is temperature. And that's why we always want to ensure we're paying attention to temperature. High tunnels would use solar energy to heat its air and its soil. So high tunnel, it's passively cooled, passively heated. Quite dissimilar from greenhouses where, you have mechanisms in there to heat or cool. So the temperature is what would regulate how fast photosynthesis and every other chemical reaction in our plants would take place. So that is what would make temperature important, because if you're not regulating your temperature, you slow these processes and then your plants are struggling to grow. The warmer it is, the faster these chemical reactions will take place. However, it can actually become too warm for your crop to survive. And like I said, we've seen firsthand where it became too warm for our crop to actually produce fruit. There are critical air temperatures, and these are minimum temperatures at which your crop would start to grow. If it's below those minimum temperatures, your crop just won't grow. There's the optimum temperature, which is the range within which your crop grows at its best. And then there's the maximum temperature, which is at which growth ceases. If it's getting too hot up in there, we're not doing justice to our efforts. I've just put a very short table with just a few crops that I've picked out, and it shows the minimum temperature. And there's a range, and this is because some of these crops we refer to as warm season. So for instance, the hot peppers, eggplants, okra, the minimum temperature that's needed there is 65 degrees, and it grows best between 70 to 85, although it can probably tolerate up to about 95 degrees. Something like cucumber, similar, we grow that mainly in the warmer months, so you see there's an optimum of between 60 to 75 degrees. Now, stuff like your carrots, your lettuce, even beets, broccoli, cabbage, some of the cold crops or cool season crops, you will see the minimum temperature there is about 20 degrees lower. It's about 40, 45 degrees. And then it grows best within a range of, say, 60 to 65 degrees, although it can tolerate 75 degrees. So that's why these crops are grown mainly in the cooler months. So to manage our air temperature, a lot of times, like I said, high tunnels, passively cooled, passively heated. So, we open we know we can open doors or raise our sides if we want to cool in the warmer months, or we can apply a shade cloth over the top of our high tunnels if we want to protect like if we have cool season crops, it's out there getting into the warmer season, we put a shade cloth there, we reduce the temperature by cutting out some of the light. Some people are using solar powered fans, or some high tunnels now would have vents above the doors. And as the hot air rises, it gets up into that area, into the roof, and it escapes through those vents above the doors. When it's in the cooler months, you want to preserve the heat, then we close up our doors, we close up our sides. Some people are using heaters, propane heaters, and different types of stuff to preserve that heat. Or we can use row covers or even low tunnels to cover our crops to hold heat in there during the cold season. So for instance, if you're doing stuff like maybe spinach, which you do in the cooler season, and it's getting too cold for your spinach, or something like salad greens or something, you can go in there, you can use a row covering to cover it, particularly if it's going to be a very cold night. You cover it, you preserve some of that heat in there, or you use a row cover or a low tunnel. In these photographs, it just gives an idea what your row covers would look like, or as against what the low tunnels would look like, similar to just a lower version of your high tunnel. Now, our air temperature, we also need to pay attention to our soil temperature. If you're going in there and you're trying to direct seed stuff and the temperature in the soil is not right, you need to know at what temperature you need to put stuff in there. So even though the soil temperature varies less than the air temperature, the top 2 inches of that soil is what influences the germination, and its temperature within that zone, that top 2 inches fluctuates a lot. So the best thing to do, if you can get hold of a soil thermometer, you keep it there and you monitor that temperature in that zone. Seeds of different crops require different soil temperatures for germination. And I also put a little chart there to, that indicates what temperature your seeds would germinate at, depending on what seed it is. A lot of this information I'll be more than happy to provide outside of this presentation, because given our time constraints, a lot of this we can, just send me a link, send me an email address or something, and I can provide this if you have questions on them. And the soil in the high tunnel would hold heat from the fall into the winter months. It acts as a sink. It, sucks that heat in, it holds it there. So a lot of times as you go to the cool season, if you're trying to direct seed a crop that say lettuce, where you need that soil temperature to get into 35 degrees, even though the air temperature may be 35 degrees and lower, ensure that your soil temperature has started to fall as well, because like I said, it holds heat from the warmer months. In terms of light and temperature, the most critical environmental factors. And the light is necessary because that is what manufactures the photosynthetates, the materials that helps to aid photosynthesis for your plant growth. So depending on where you locate your high tunnel, that can impact the access to light. Trees can provide a shade over your high tunnel, so you want to keep it, away from trees. If you're having multiple high tunnels and you put them too close together, they can cast shadow on each other and affect the light, the access to light. Even within the high tunnels, in terms of your planting, you want to ensure you're observing the adequate plant spacing or recommended plant spacing. If you put, we know we can go a little bit more intensively in the high tunnel structures, but then if you plant stuff too close, then it impacts light in one crop, shade in another crop, and it affects the amount of light that's hitting other plants and stuff like that. You want to plant your tall crops on the north side to affect it shading the shorter crops, and particularly in the summer months, if you have anything there that requires a little bit of cooling or a little bit of shade, you can always come in and use a shade cloth over the top to provide, reduce the amount of light getting to your crops. Irrigation is the other thing that we want to touch briefly for a minute before I wrap this up. And you want to locate your high tunnel near a year-round supply of quality water. If you don't want to be in a situation where you're fetching water from someplace, that can add a cost to your operation. Periodically test your water source to ensure it's suitable for irrigation purposes. One, it has to do with, it has to do with salinity issues. One, then I've known of instances where rust in the water or iron in the water would block up the irrigation equipment. But then two, food safety regulations may require specific microbial type testing to ensure that you're using safe water on your food. Your irrigation schedule will depend on the crop you have. It depends on the stage at which the crop is. It depends on the weather, soil type, and the irrigation system. So if you have a sprinkler that's providing more water than maybe a drip, that determines how often you'll get in there and irrigate. I had a staff out here who one time didn't go to the house to put water on the plants because he said, well, it's raining. And then you got to remind him, well, inside of the high tunnel, the rain is not getting in there. So you still got to go in there and put on the irrigation. So we need to remember, even if it's rainy on the outside, we still need to get in the high tunnel and do what we have to do. Each operation will need to develop its own schedule. What works for your neighbor won't work for you. Even though he may be doing tomato, you may be doing tomato. Like I said earlier, it depends on your soil. He may have a nice loamy clay soil, a nice sandy loamy type soil. You may have a clay soil. Your soil may be holding a lot more water. You don't need to irrigate as often. So, you develop your system based on your conditions. And, you can always seek out advice from those, well, first of all, from your local extension service staff or from the sales representatives of those irrigation equipment companies. Your irrigation goal really should be to provide adequate water for your crop production and for crop quality. And, you know, there's no right or wrong way to irrigate your crops. You can do it by hand. You know, your first photograph, there's a guy out there doing it by hand. You can have the drip irrigation setup, which is the center photograph, or you can have sprinklers, which is the end photograph. Many people shy away from the sprinkler system because they don't like to have their leaves wet and all of that, but because of depending on your crop, if you're doing something maybe like spinach or those microgreens and you're coming in with those harvesters that you kind of get close to the ground to harvest, you know, your drip tape may not be the best thing to have on the ground there. And, you know, each of these systems has their pros, has pros, it has cons. You know, like I said, drip lines get in the way of cultivation and harvesting and stuff like that. The sprinklers would leave the leaves wet, even though it's easy to wet a large area. And if you're doing it by hand, you know, you can do very localized operation, but that is labor intensive. So like I said, each has its pros and its cons. And with that, I'm a little bit over my time, but I want to put a wrap on this. And I'll be through this session for the entire day. Feel free to put your questions up there in the chat. I know our administrator for today's activity would be more than happy to share this with us and get you answers if we don't have time to answer questions at the end of these sessions. So with this, I'll say thank you for listening. And like I said, I'll be right on here for the rest of the day. Thank you.
All right. Can you all hear me?
Sure, we can.
Oh, good. All right. Thanks, Sean, for that presentation. If you got any questions for Sean about this high tone, you can put them in the chat box. Later on, we might be able to answer some of these questions after we get some of these other presentations done. Next, we have Ms. Sherry Smith. She's from the University of Arkansas plant pathologist. She's the instructor of the Division of Agriculture. And she has disease management presentation for us today. Ms. Smith, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
I am ready. Well. Okay.
Sean, you need to stop sharing your screen.
Does everyone see my screen?
Not yet. Sean needs to end his screen share. There you go. Now we see it.
Okay then. Okay, well, it's always a challenge when I'm asked to speak about a multitude of crop problems in 30 minutes. So I'm just going to hit some highlights of some common problems that we see. A couple of them are particularly common in high tunnel production or greenhouse production for that matter. And one, if we look at tomatoes, this one, although I do see it in the field, it is more common in greenhouses. And this is called tomato leaf mold. And the initial symptoms, if you look at the upper surface of the leaf, will often resemble manganese deficiency, or magnesium deficiency, I should say. But the picture on the left at the underside of the leaf, initial symptoms will look like this with these pale spots. And then you get these brown necrotic spots on the leaf. And this is the sporulation. And this can cause you leaf loss, and that ties in directly to fruit loss. So optimal growth for this pathogen is humidity greater than 85%, and it's able to infect at a pretty wide range of temperatures. Optimal temperature between 71 and 75 degrees, but it can occur as low as 50 and as high as 90. So this can be a problem in your greenhouse or high tunnel. So we want you to use drip irrigation and keep the foliage as dry as possible. Keep the plants spaced and use sterilization techniques for your ties, stakes, trellises, etc. And good air circulation is very important with this. Also, keeping the night temperature in greenhouses higher than the outside temperatures to avoid dew formation. on the foliage. And of course, we want you to clean up any crop residue at the end of the season. Chemical control: Inspire Super good, Revus Top good, Tanos good, Magazine Fair, Quadras Top fair, and your coppers are fair. But the problem is in greenhouses is poor sanitation as a rule leads to this problem year after year. Here's another nasty one that we see in high tunnels and in greenhouses on tomato, and that's botrytis blight. And this is just a killer in a greenhouse situation with tomatoes. And if you look at the stems, if they're affected with botrytis blight, you'll see gray, fuzzy, raised, and even on the leaf lesions, and often the leaf lesions are kind of triangular to begin with on the edge of the leaf, but you'll see the little fuzzy botrytis growth on the edge of the leaf. And then we have a picture of what it'll look like on tomato. So once again, you want to keep the humidity as low as possible. Now, the thing about botrytis that I should have pointed out on the last slide is that optimal growth for botrytis is between 64 to 75 Fahrenheit. Avoid overhead irrigation to minimize plant wetness. Do not work on wet plants. Ventilate greenhouses to try to keep the relative humidity low, and temperatures above 70 discourage botrytis. And generally, good sanitation. I can't stress the sanitation enough. If you have a plant that's affected or a plant part, bag it before trying to remove it so you don't scatter the spores everywhere. Endura, Ariston, Inspire Super, I can never pronounce, Preaxor, Botran, Bravo. Homeowners will have to rely on chlorothalonol-based products. Okay, so botrytis and anthracnose resistant testing, University of Georgia's Molecular Diagnostic Lab does this. And it costs about $250 to test for botrytis resistance. But if you're having botrytis problems, this is real handy to know what chemical products will be effective. Okay, still on tomatoes, moving quick because I got a lot of ground to cover here in a few minutes. Viruses, we do have a virus problem in high tunnels. And this comes from a couple of sources. Cucumber mosaic virus, for example, is aphid transmitted. Tomato spotted wilt is thrips transmitted, and tobacco mosaic is transmitted through infected seed or by handling plants after using tobacco products without washing your hands thoroughly first. So if you have workers that work in your high tunnel or your greenhouse and they're smokers, they can very, very easily spread tobacco mosaic to your plants. And this strappy looking plant, that's cucumber mosaic. And the other one is one of the mosaic viruses. And I've got this picture of Roundup damage just to give you guys an idea of how sometimes this is mistaken for one of the mosaic viruses. But you'll notice that the yellowing or bleaching is only at the base of the leaflets. So this is Roundup damage, and often people will not think that they've used this product in the greenhouse or high tunnel, but it's been used outside to control weeds around the outside, and it drifted inside to cause this problem. And here's tomato spotted wilt virus, so the symptoms on the fruit and some typical symptoms on the foliage. You see the black or brownish netting on the foliage and some little spots, and then the plant wilts. Now, if the tomato plant acquires this virus when it's really young, it may never set fruit. If it acquires it when it's older, the fruit may look like this. And of course, when I'm giving this talk to master gardeners, someone will always ask if it's safe to eat the fruit of a virus plant. And yes, plant viruses do not move to people or we'd all be dead by now. But the fruit doesn't taste good. It's usually woody and the flavor is kind of flat. So it won't hurt you to eat this kind of fruit. It just isn't very good. And that one is spread by the thrips. And these insects are often a chronic problem in greenhouse or high tunnels because the environment in there gives them overwintering capabilities that they don't have outside the greenhouse. And it's difficult to control because of the wide range of crops that are affected by tomato spotted wilt. And almost anything you plant for pretty in the garden can also get it. And sometimes there will be, if you're an organic grower, sometimes they'll be growing some of these ornamentals in the same high tunnel that they're growing vegetables. And of course, weeds can get it too. That's why we want good weed control in the house and around the house. You just have to be careful with your herbicides. And we test for these viruses in the lab. Used to, we used the ELISA test. You see all these little wells, and through a series of chemical reactions to an antibody at the bottom of the well, if the plant was positive for one of these viruses, then the well would change colors. And we still use ELISA a lot in the lab. But the drawback, 4.5, depending on what virus we're testing for and what brand kit we're using. We do have these handy dandy sticks now. They work on the same kind of, well, actually they work exactly the same as, say, a pregnancy test, and they take about 2 minutes. You grind up about a quarter's worth of the suspicious plant material in a little mesh bag with a buffer and stick the sticks down into the tips of the sticks into the liquid, and it wicks up. A line will appear showing that the stick is working. A second line means that it's positive for the virus. And I've had one tomato plant more than once light up for all 4 viruses that you can test with this little stick. You can test for cucumber mosaic virus, vector by aphids, impatient necrotic spot thrips, tomato spotted wilt thrips, and the tobacco mosaic by infected seed or using tobacco products and handling your plants without washing your hands. And these are handy dandy little tests. And anybody can buy them. The company would be thrilled to sell them to you. The drawback is that if we buy 2 packages of this test with their little buffer bags, that's enough for us to test 48 plants. And it cost us $730 for that many tests. However, testing is still free here at the lab, so be sure to send us your samples. Weed control, insecticides. The problem with insecticides is that some thrips have developed resistance to some of our more common insecticides. This mesh, which is so fine that water will hardly go through it, will exclude a lot of insects, but also is so fine that a lot of people don't use it because it takes a lot of cleaning or replacement to keep it from clogging up because it's such a fine mesh. We want you to destroy infected plants. Use resistant cultivars whenever possible. Down in the California Valley, they use reflective mulches. They found that thrips, for example, don't like to land on reflective surfaces. And sticky traps are not for control. Sticky traps are to tell you that they're there. The foliar diseases that we see most commonly, whether inside or outside the greenhouse or high tunnel, is early blight, which is alternaria, and the bullseyes, which can occur on the stems, the fruit, or the leaves, are indicative of early blight. And this will defoliate the plant on your really susceptible varieties. And there is the stem canker caused by the other alternaria. And what happens is it does not occur on the leaves or the fruit. Those dead spots on the leaves and the fruit are caused by it attacking the stem and shutting the stem down. There is some good resistance out here for this alternaria. And septoria. Septoria is a nasty disease, and once you get it in the field, if you don't practice some pretty good control measures such as crop rotation and chemical control, this can burn up your tomato plants every season. And you have the small spots, and they can resemble bacterial spot, but we can tell easily under the microscope which is which by the numerous amount of septoria spores. So control for these fungal leaf spots, crop rotation whenever possible. Fungicides, and this has some of the ones in there for homeowners. And then commercial fungicides, Quadris, Cabrio, Flint, and Bravo. But I can't stress enough that avoiding overhead irrigation whenever possible, crop rotation, and the use of resistant varieties. Resistance is always going to be the easy way to control diseases. Moving away from tomatoes, because we are speeding through this so I can get some of this in, strawberry anthracnose. About 3 different Colletotricum species can cause anthracnose. The symptoms are the same. This, in a bad year, will be a tremendous headache to our strawberry growers. And you can see the depressed lesions on the fruit. If you look with your magnifying glass, you can actually see the kind of wet-looking pinkish spore masses of the fungus. Same thing when it's on the stems. You see over here where it's attacking a stem? Under magnification, you can see what it looks like, the fruiting bodies of the fungus on the stem. Disease-free plants, that can be almost impossible. Avoid overhead irrigation, remove infected plant parts, cap down in rotation with Pristine or Fontellus or Cabrio or Switch or Elevate or Rovrol. There is some resistance out there. Once again, Georgia is testing for resistance for anthracnose and botrytis both. And I see you're there, Aaron. If you've got any updates on that, feel free to jump in at any time here. Because strawberry botrytis is a huge headache, whether it occurs in the field or in a high tunnel. And the spores cannot cause a lot of problem initially, even though flowers can be affected and not showing it, but then this is what happens to your fruit. And we have had strawberry plants come into the clinic that the boat in the crown before it even got to the stage of putting out fruit. Captain in rotation with these chemicals, but resistance to FRAC 11 fungicides has been found. And that's why if you're having a problem controlling this in your strawberries, whether it's in a high tunnel or in the field, you might want to have some tests done to see whether you have fungicide resistance out there in your botrytis. Now there's a couple of diseases that are common no matter what crops are in the high tunnel, and those is caused by too much water and the pathogen being present. Both Phytophthora and Pythium spores have 2 tails so they can swim, and they swim through water between particles of soil to the roots of your plants. And you can see here in this picture of the crown of this strawberry a sign that you may have Phytophthora. Unfortunately, without a microscope or serological testing, although it looks like Phytophthora and it was Phytophthora, there are some other crown diseases that look almost identical to this. Resistant cultivars, there are some out there. Avoid low wet spots. Ridamil Gold and Alliette are labeled for it. We find often in high tunnels that there's a lot of overwatering. And like I said, the spores swim, so it's fatal to have too much water, to have sogginess all the time. Leather rot, this is a different Phytophthora, and this enters through, well, what happens usually is it attacks fruit that's laying on the ground. And so the fruit becomes really hard and almost mummified. Resistant cultivars, again, there is resistance to this out there. The same problems that you have with crown and root rot with a Phytophthora, you have with this Phytophthora, and you use the same chemicals for control. And if possible, you don't allow the strawberry fruit to touch the soil. And Pythium. A couple of years ago, we had a serious Pythium problem across Arkansas, and it was because the plants were coming out of a nursery. A lot of growers were buying plants from the same nursery, and that nursery was having a problem with Phytophthora root rot. I mean, Pythium root rot, excuse me. Well, with Pythium, when you go to wash the soil off the roots of the plant, often the roots will start to dissolve in your hand. And instead of having a normal large mass of healthy roots, you'll just have either a nub with nothing or just a few roots. And you can see that these roots are not enough roots to support a plant this size, and they're all blackened. Once again, this occurs in soils that are too wet because these spores swim. Now, when the soil isn't too wet, if you have Phytophthora and Pythium out there, then the pathogen will form cysts in the soil, and they'll wait until it gets wet again. These pathogens are ubiquitous out in the fields, out in the landscape. They're there pretty much everywhere all the time. They just don't cause you a problem until the environmental conditions get right for disease. So be aware that not only does being too wet suppress the amount of oxygen available to the roots in the soil, but it allows these particular pathogens in there to cause you a lot of problem. Phosphite is labeled for Pythium and strawberry. Ridamil and Alliette are labeled for Phytophthora, but no mention of Pythium and strawberry. So phosphate is labeled for Pythium, also labeled for Phytophthora. And zipping through strawberries, because I was just hitting the highlights, when we get to our brassica crops like turnips and cabbage, there are a couple of pathogens that cause us problems in there. And one is black spot, and you can see why it's called black spot. This is a fungal pathogen. Here's anthracnose. And usually that'll start out as these kind of round lesions. They can coalesce and turn into bigger spots and blight whole leaves, but they start out generally looking like this. And white spot, Cercospora or Cercosporilla species. And we have a lot of this in Arkansas, whether out in the field or in a high tunnel. Blackleg, this is another fungal pathogen, and it causes these lesions on the leaves, and it's called blackleg because it attacks the stem. And right above where the stem is, you can see the fruiting bodies of this pathogen. Bacterial leaf spot can be mistaken often for anthracnose or one of the other diseases. And a lot of times the lesions will tear in the center and become raggedy. You may wonder why I've not mentioned any fungicides yet. I'm getting to that at the end of this. I see this pathogen every year. It's black rot caused by Xanthomonas. And you can see how the lesions on the edge of the leaf look a lot like that blackleg lesions on leaf, which is caused by a fungus. And you don't treat them the same because the products to control fungal infections are different from the ones to control bacterial infections. Control for all of these, or control for these bacterial is strict sanitation and hot water treatments for suspected seed lots, 15 to 25 minutes at 50 degrees C. And that will kill bacteria in these bacterial diseases that are seed-borne. Downy mildew is a problem in high tunnel, as well as out in the field. And this is the sporulation. It'll look kind of whitish to begin with. And the leaves have been attacked by it on this cauliflower. There it is at a slightly later stage, sporulating on the underside of the leaf. And this is what an infection will do to your fruit, whether it's Brussels sprouts or cabbage or cauliflower. Controlling fungi on cold crops, and we have a list here: Endura, Manab, Ridamil, Gold, Bravo, Cabrio, Weatherstick, Quadras, Switch. Those are a few. But the important thing is to know whether you are treating for a fungus or a bacterial infection, because none of this does you any good on a bacterial infection. Controlling downy mildew, Ridamil, Cabrio, Aliette, Quadras, Presidio, Reason, and Rebus are all labeled for downy mildew on cold crops. And you can see if we look at what is labeled for downy mildew, it's not exactly the same list that is for these other fungal leaf spots. That's because downy mildew is not a true fungus. Controlling fungal diseases on leafy greens. If you're commercial, Quadras, Quadras Top, Inspire Super, and Fontellus. Downy mildew, Rebus on leafy greens. But for the bacterial spots, what you've got is copper. So I whipped right by that and get in some of the highlights on tomatoes. Hope you got some. Hey, Aaron, do you have anything to add? Botrytis resistance?
Yeah, we did a little bit of testing from some samples in Lone Oak and near Fort Smith, and we really didn't find too many resistance, or too many types of resistance. Just some of the ones you would expect with the older fungicides, but the newer fungicides seem to be still working pretty well.
Well, that's good news. They have a real good setup at University of Georgia to test for it if someone is having control problems and suspects that they might have resistance problem in their field or their high tunnel. Anyway, that's all I got today, guys.
All right. I see one question here in the chat box. Is there something to use for blight that is organic?
Well, there you go. The options are somewhat limited, but Actinovate is labeled for organic growers over a wide range of crops. And then for some of the fungal things, the clay applied to the leaves seems to provide some relief. As some of the coppers are labeled for organic. They're not as effective against fungi as they are bacterial diseases. It's just difficult for organic growers. That's why many organic growers grow triple the amount of crop as a non-organic grower. So instead of putting all of their eggs in one basket, so to speak, they will have a high tunnel here and a field over there, and then a backup place so that if they get a disease that they're having a problem with in one of these locations, they may still be able to harvest enough of a crop when all is said and done. And that's one reason that organic produce costs more also, because they have to grow more in some years to get enough of a good crop.
Right. Okay. I see another question about hemp plants. Do you accept hemp plants at the where I know I don't know. I know if you grow hemp, you have to have permission to transfer it, and they want to know exactly where it's being transferred from and to. So
Okay. Well, here's the rule for hemp here at the clinic, and this is the federal regulations. Okay, you cannot mail us a hemp specimen.
right.
Whoever has the license has to physically carry it into the lab, and they can't leave it with us. They have to stand there while we're looking at it, and then they have to take the remains of it back with them. We're not allowed to retain it, even to destroy it.
We would have to make an appointment with you then.
Well, right, normally not, but because we are still being so careful because of the COVID virus, then yeah, it'd be good for you, because we're not here at the lab all day as normal. We're here in the mornings, and then after we look at physical samples, because after 10 weeks of not accepting any physical samples, just digital samples, we started taking physical samples again. But after we have finished looking at them, then we lock the lab and work from home the rest of the day. So yeah, we need a heads up if you're going to bring hemp.
Okay.
Problem with hemp.
I got some more questions for you later on, because I grew hemp, been growing hemp for 2 years now, and we had some problems with our processors on, they said we had milk mold and mildew, and I disagreed with them just because a few spots was on the leaf, it wasn't on that bud later on. But we're getting into somebody else's time, and Mr. Aaron Cole is going to be next. Extension horticulture specialist. And Mr. Cole, I'm going to have some questions with you about hemp. But right now you're on.
Is that me? Is that who you're talking about?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let me see if I can share this.
And also, there's some more comments in the chat box about buying specific cultivars from Yarn Park. And Russell Bean also said, check your OMRI catalog, ORMI catalog for organic materials.
Okay, can everybody see the right screen on here? Sometimes it swaps. Y'all let me know if it looks weird for some reason. Okay, so my name's Aaron Cato. I'm the extension specialist in horticulture IPM. So basically what that means is I work with fruits and vegetables, and I dabble a little bit in pecans, and I work with insect management, disease management, and weed management within those crops. And so I do a little bit of everything in all of them. I'm an entomologist by training, so that's what I got my master's and PhD in, but I've learned a lot about management of diseases because it all kind of fits together. And so today we're going to talk about pest management, and we're going to kind of hit on a lot of stuff on disease. It'll fit nicely in with what Sherry talked about, but also we'll talk about insects as well. And if y'all have any questions, let me know, and I'll try to answer some of the ones that have been asked already. So you'll see that a lot of the stuff I talk about, if you ask questions about organic control of some of these blights, a lot of it's going to be cultural control and preventing diseases, and so that'll be covered a lot here, but also some of the cultivar type questions. And so that's just some of my information. I work for across the entire state. So whether you're in Eastern or Western Arkansas, I'm based out of Little Rock at the UA Extension State Office. That's my cell phone and my email. Please give me a call or shoot me a text or an email if you have any questions about this talk or just any kind of pest questions. It's my job to help anybody in the state that's a commercial grower that has these kind of issues. Then also my Twitter, if you're on that. And then another thing that Dr. Amanda McWhirter, which I hope that you've heard from before, and I do, is a blog. And so this is just where we try to identify problems in the state, but or we put out posts about some of the work that we're doing. And so you see on the right there, there's one post where I put out where we had a downy mildew outbreak in the state. And so just things to look for and things to do if you find it. And then another one, which is a little bit different, kind of a change of pace, which is Amanda talking about the different cultivars we tried with county agents across the state. So just some kind of a variety of stuff we post, but you can sign up for a newsletter. So monthly, we'll just send you an email about the kind of stuff that we posted, and it's all Arkansas centric. And so I think it'd be a good thing for anyone that's wanting to get into growing in the state to sign up for. And I was, but you have Sherry Smith here. And so I was going to recommend that all of you keep the idea of the plant health clinic in your mind. If you ever have an issue, you're not sure what's going on, call your county agent and get a sample sent in to Sherry. As you can see, she's seen a lot and she can identify what you got going on. And that's always a good step one to solving an issue or preventing it, is knowing what you have. But also it's going to be the same for our nematode diagnostic lab. Sending samples to Sherry is free. It's not free for the diagnostic lab for nematodes, but it's pretty cheap. I think $15 to $30 if you're a resident. And so it's pretty reasonable for the amount of information it'll give you. And the main resource that I work off of and that I contribute to is the Southeastern Vegetable Extension Workers Handbook. It's a vegetable crop handbook. And this is a really good resource for anyone who wants to grow vegetables in the Southeast. It has production information. It has pest management, whether disease, insect, or weed management. It has a list of options for organic pest management and pest management in greenhouses, which can be similar to high tunnels. And this is a free resource. You can see the link for there, and I'll send this to Karen so that she can get you this PowerPoint. And so this is free for anyone to use, and it's probably one of the best things that's very Southeastern centric, which, especially in Eastern Arkansas, it's going to have that Southeastern climate. So we're here today talking about pest management and high tunnels. We know why, I think, just from Sean Francis's talk, why we grow in high tunnels. This is a protected environment, right? It's the type of protected agriculture where you're trying to limit some of the pressures from the environment into a smaller spot to kind of, get better production. And so we usually see is intensive vegetable production or fruit production, like Sherry talked about strawberries and some blackberries in a small area. We can get a season extension, and so that's going to allow you to grow for longer periods throughout the year, but usually because it's increasing temperature. We see a decreased impact from environment or climate, especially in today's age where we get all this excessive rainfall. So you can see a decreased impact from that rainfall, which can lower the quality or kill your plants. And we see a decreased risk from some pests. And there's a very big caveat to that, because you are decreasing the risk from some pests, but you're also increasing risk from others. And there's a lot of pests that you're really not changing the environment enough to really make a difference. But so what you really need to consider for pest management in high tunnels is what types of new pests you're going to deal with. And to do that, you really need to understand the environment within a high tunnel to shape control. And I'm really glad that Sean talked a lot about the environment in the high tunnel, because everything that he talked about is going to be especially important for pest management in a high tunnel. Managing your environment and understanding your optimal growing conditions, you need to think about all that for pest management. And so if you know you need to grow at a certain temperature, then you need to think about what pests are going to do well in that temperature, or humidity levels and things like that. But you still need to practice sustainable IPM within these confines. So the way that you're trying to grow, think about how you practice sustainable IPM within that. And so just in case someone on the call doesn't know what IPM is integrated pest management. And so when we're talking about a sustainable approach to managing pests, then IPM is usually the framework that we're always going to recommend. And so this is just an approach to managing pests, so whether it be pathogens that cause disease, insects that feed on the plant or spread viruses, or weeds, that's going to combine several tactics to achieve long-term solutions. So we're thinking not just this year or this production cycle, we're thinking for the future when we're making our decisions. And we're trying to make decisions that are going to make you economically sustainable, so make it to where you're still here to produce next year, where you're trying to make some profit, but also that it's ecologically sustainable. And so you have a limited impact on the environment around you. And so you're not spraying too many chemicals that's going to potentially hurt the environment or potentially hurt the people living around that. And so usually the biggest part of this is that we're trying to combine several tactics. And whenever you do that, you almost always have a positive economical and ecological impact. And these tactics are pest prevention, cultural control, which is modifying the environment to make it less amenable for pests, biological control, which would be bringing in like some kind of insect or pathogen to help control your pests. Mechanical control, like hoeing, would be a good example for in a high tunnel, or like flame weeding or something like that, or tillage. And then chemical control. And I'm sure what most of you can recognize is that for the majority of our history in agriculture, especially since the mid-1900s, chemical control is what most people have relied on. And so this is controlling your pests through repeated uses of pesticides. And this is still going to be a part of a pest management plan. But when you're considering your chemical control options, it always needs to be under the idea that you've already tried to maximize preventing pests. You've already tried to create an environment where pests won't do well, and you've thought about, doing as good as biological control as you can and mechanical control. And sometimes those don't always work out for the system you want. And if you're talking about protected agriculture, high tunnels are a form of cultural control. And so, especially for when you're thinking about diseases, one way to prevent many diseases that pop up because of excessive rainfall is to use protected ag like high tunnels. So you're already starting out using a type of integrated pest management, or one thing within the integrated pest management if you're growing in a high tunnel. But what you need to know is that similar strategies are not going to be necessary within these high tunnels when you compare to a field. So everything that's listed out here are all things that you think about when you're growing in a field, which you're also going to have to consider when you're growing in a high tunnel. So it's crop rotation, crop orientation, or which way you point it, your optimum growing conditions. You want to make sure you're growing a healthy plant, because if you're not, they're going to be more susceptible to disease and insect pests, or be more attractive to insects. Using disease-resistant or insect-resistant varieties, sanitation, scouting, and preventative fungicide applications. These are all things that you need to consider in both the field and the high tunnel. But the idea is that these strategies are going to be modified based on the specific environment within your tunnel, and also based on the crops that you hope to grow. And so I know Sherry did a great job of talking about all these different diseases. And if you understand what diseases you may be dealing with, then you may understand how you need to modify your environment to help prevent or decrease the amount of those diseases or impact they're going to have on you. So with diseases specifically, we should always be thinking about the disease triangle whenever we're managing them. And so the idea is that for a disease to occur in your plant, the pathogen has to be present. So these are all points on the triangle on the top right there. There has to be a host plant that is susceptible, and the environment has to be amenable to disease transmission. And so when we're talking about your vegetables, most of them are pretty susceptible to a lot of diseases. Pathogens do a pretty good job of getting into your high tunnel, but the environment is something you can regulate a lot within that. And so just at a baseline, we know there's pretty big differences within the environment. And we know that within each disease, they don't have the same requirements of environment type to be successful. So let's just look at some differences that we know they're going to be, and I know Sean talked a lot about this as well. In a field environment, humidity is going to be based a lot on the weather, usually worse in the late summer when we start getting a lot of water, transpiration, the hair gets kind of heavy. But we do have humidity it's pretty high in this area of the world in Arkansas, especially when you get into the Delta, which used to be a swamp. In a high tunnel environment, it's even worse. We usually have excessive humidity, and what this means is we have prolonged leaf wetness. Almost every disease that we're going to talk about needs a wet leaf to be able to cause disease in the plant, basically. And so for transmission of the pathogen into the plant, you need wet leaves for most of our worst diseases. And so having prolonged leaf wetness is always going to be an issue when you're talking about diseases in vegetables. In a field, rainfall can be a very big issue. You have potential flooding, Can affect leaf wetness. We know, especially in the spring, we get a lot of days in a row where we're getting rain every single day. And so leaves just stay wet the whole time. And then we get splashing. And a splashing of water droplets is a way that many disease or pathogens have evolved to move from plant to plant. And so diseases like bacterial diseases, like the bacterial leaf spot or anthracnose, these diseases are moving around through rainfall splashes. And a high tunnel, one of the best positives of a high tunnel is you're protected from rainfall. I'm not going to say always from flooding. We know that we get a lot of flooding that occurs where even if you have your high tunnel in a good spot, water can still get up in it. But for the most part, like an excessive rainfall event, it's not going to affect it as much as it would in the field environment. Minimal effect on leaf wetness. When you get a rain event, maybe just around the edges get affected a little bit, but for the most of your tunnel, not going to get affected by rainfall. And minimal splashing if you're using drip irrigation. Now, if you're using sprinkler because that's what you have to use, then there's still going to be an issue with a lot of splashing in your environment. Also, if you get wet leaves and you move around in the tunnel a lot and you're contacting them, you can still get some splashing. But we would expect less splashing in a high tunnel environment than a field environment outside of using a lot of sprinkler irrigation. Temperature in a field environment, it's variable. You get periods of the year where diseases are going to do well because of high temperatures. So that's a lot of times why you'll see recommendations from someone like me or Sherry when we say, you know, you don't want to plant that vegetable later in the summer. You want to make sure you get it in early and get it out, because later in the year, the leaf spot diseases really just take over because the temperature just gets perfect for them, and maybe some of the other diseases, and that's why it can be a problem. Well, in high tunnels, we almost always are at these amenable temperatures for a lot of the problem diseases we're at. And so, you know, temperature can be very excessive, and it's something you have to regulate a lot. And then wind. A lot of our diseases are carried through the wind, like downy mildew would be a good example. The spores for these pathogens are blowing in, especially in like the cucurbit downy mildew. And in the high tunnel versus the field, there's not going to be much difference because, as Sean talked about, you're regulating the humidity within that high tunnel by using wind from the outside sources. So don't expect that things that are coming in through the wind are not going to come into your high tunnels. I think most people are surprised by how often that they get field pests in their high tunnels, but remember that you need to be opening up this high tunnel to allow the wind to move through. So let's look at these just a little bit more specifically. We know leaf wetness is an issue in high tunnels, and this is going to increase diseases that need prolonged wetness to thrive. Sherry talked about a lot of these, but leaf mold, botrytis gray mold, and powdery mildew, a lot of these are going to be worse in high tunnels and are because of excessive leaf wetness. Rainfall or splashing, this is just not going to be as big of an issue depending on your irrigation type and within a high tunnel. And so the diseases that are going to really live and die by this splashing are not going to be as much of an issue, like the bacterial diseases in pepper and tomato, and then anthracnose species. And so, you know, we have strawberries in high tunnels in the state, and they don't deal with almost no anthracnose within those, you know, within the core of the high tunnel. But botrytis is still a very big issue because they're moist leaves and there's still movement of air around them. And then I expect the wind to still blow in spores from the diseases where that's the main transmission. So let's go through some of the management strategies in high tunnels now that we kind of understand the environment within it and how that differs. So cultural controls are going to be your go-to, especially for organic growers. You know, and when you're ever growing organic, modifying the environment to be amenable is always going to be the way that you're going to be able to maximize your control, because there's just not going to be very many chemical control methods or chemicals that are going to work very well. So you can always go into it clean and modify it in a great way to manage diseases. Orientation of the tunnel is going to be one of those. I know Sean talked a lot about maximizing sunlight. You don't really want to get shade in too much of it. Just for for production purposes, there's a lot to go with that, but also with just how long leaves are going to stay wet. And so if you're in the shade for a long time, that sun's not going to burn off the moisture on those leaves as quickly. You want to maximize airflow. It's going to decrease your humidity and decrease the amount of times that your leaves are wet. So for single bay tunnels, a lot of times you want to position it perpendicular to prevailing winds. So that's going to make it to where more wind is hitting the long side, and so that's going to just be more surface area hit by the wind. And then multi-bay tunnels, especially those with the roll-up sides, those are going to need to be the opposite, because you're you're going to have many openings, so that's going to be your long-sided tip. As Sean talked about a lot, manage humidity, temperature, and moisture by rolling up the sides to make the environment potentially more or less amenable for diseases. And then think about other ways to maximize airflow, whether that be using, really getting a handle on your weed management. Consider landscape fabric, but there's a lot of other issues that go in with that. But proper plant spacing. You can think about your space and think about how many plants you need based on a yield to get really, make profits. But if you're really jamming in them and they're too much, you're not going to get as much airflow. You're going to get more of this condensation build up, and it's really going to, increase disease. And then what you'll find out is, well, I didn't increase my yield because my disease got so much worse. And then select disease or insect resistant varieties when possible. I know there was a question about this earlier, and almost always I would say these cultivars are going to be more expensive. Usually the ones that have these bred in are newer, and so a lot of times they're going to be more expensive, but also because the company knows they have something there and they know how much value it is. So it will be more expensive, but I would almost guess on almost all cases, if especially that you're dealing with these diseases, it's going to be worth it, because that's just another avenue of risk that you're able to mitigate. And something you can't really control for. If you get your fusarium in the ground in your high tunnel, then you're going to need to grow tomatoes resistant to those fusarium races. If you have tomato spotted wilt virus in your area, which is in Arkansas, you need to be growing varieties that are resistant. And it's just always going to be that case, because you're not going to be able to control the things moving these around as well as you are with resistance. Sherry talked about sanitation for a lot of the diseases she mentioned, and this is very important. This starts with avoiding bringing in disease inoculum. So when we say disease inoculum, we say, we're basically saying don't bring in plants that are already sick. They already have the disease, because when they get in, they're then going to produce spores, and you're just starting with a worse situation. So if you start with more disease, you're going to end up with a lot more disease. Use high quality disease-free seed and transplants. Usually what that means is try to find sources that are reputable. Sometimes it can be more expensive, but this is all savings in the long run. And so instead of buying them from Lowe's or Walmart down the road, think about going on online sources. Think about raising your own transplants instead of buying ones that look to be diseased. You don't always see it on transplants, but I know a lot of times when I've gone to some of these stores, and you can see plants that don't look very healthy, because they're being a lot of times maintained by people who are, maintaining it way more than they can have time for. So they're going to be sickly and more likely to get disease. And depending on your situation, consider fungicide seed treatments. I know a lot of places like Harris Seeds, they have the option for that when you buy it. And if you know that you have a pretty good risk of disease in your household, then that's probably a good option to go with. Remove as much disease inoculum between cropping cycles as possible. So you want to remove entire plants and roots. I know that this is really an issue when you start thinking about organic matter and healthy soil, but a lot of these diseases are feeding on the roots of your plants. And so I have a picture there of southern blight. This needs tomato material to really propagate. Now it can survive in the soil for 2 to 3 years or more, through the little, almost little BB-like sclerotia you see there, which are these hardened pockets of spores. But if you're removing plant material and roots, you're removing these spores with it as well. And so it's always good practice to try to get these plants out of there. Practice good weed control and remove weeds. Sherry listed off many viruses and diseases that are also getting on weed species and then moving between weeds and your crops. And so if you're leaving weeds in there, or say you're hoeing them and leaving them in the soil, a lot of times that means they can just move right over onto your plants, or they may be able to give a good way for them to get into your soil. You can compost, burn, or bury a lot of these plants, always outside of the high tunnel, or as far away as possible. But from what I've read, that you can compost a lot of these things as long as it's got a really good cycle to it, and you don't want to, just kind of compost and move it back in. And there is some option for deep tilling as a way of sanitation as well. If you can get the machinery in to turn the soil over really well. So we had a lot of issues this year with southern blight in high tunnels. And, it needs to be at this top 1 to 2 inches of the soil to infect tomatoes. And so if you're able to turn the soil over, you may be able to decrease some of the inoculum that's going to be able to actually infect your tomatoes. But it's going to come with issues with soil health when you do that. And so it's always a give and take when you make those kind of decisions. Crop rotation is probably going to be the go-to after sanitation and making sure your tunnel's in the right spot. But in every type of agriculture, crop rotation is just a cornerstone of pest management. Even when you start thinking about these big ag things like rice and soybeans in the area, all of them are rotated. People rotate rice to soybeans, they rotate cotton to corn or soybeans, they rotate corn and soybeans. What they know is that there are latent diseases in the soil that every year are just going to decrease your yield over time. And it's at a heightened risk when we're talking about growing in a very finite space that you're not going to be able to move around very easily. And when you rotate these crops, you're going to mitigate issues due to residue and soil-borne diseases. And what we find is it's just very often hindered in high tunnels. Many growers buy high tunnels with a market in mind, or a crop they're going to grow in mind. And what it leads to is I'm going to grow tomatoes and sell to these people, and I'm going to grow lettuce and sell to these people. Well, if you have a very stringent market source, you're going to have a much less opportunity to actually rotate. And so it's a really good idea to not think about your high tunnel as just a vehicle for tomatoes. We had a person this year who had southern blight on their tomatoes, and we said, really you need to rotate to a grass. And I mean, what grass are they going to grow? They weren't going to grow sweet corn in their tunnel. And so they were very limited, but they had grown tomatoes so many times in a row that, I mean, almost every plant was getting southern blight, which is very rare to have it that bad, but this was a bad year for it. And so, if you pigeonhole yourself into that situation, it's hard to get out of it. So you always want to go on the front end with a bit more diversity so you can mitigate some of these issues. Going fallow on a hard tunnel. How do you justify not growing in your high tunnel when you've put in the you made this purchase of the materials for a high tunnel? How do you justify leaving one area open? Whereas if you just had land, it's easier to justify smaller spots to not grow and potentially lose some of these disease issues. You generally have less crop options in a high tunnel. Sometimes you have more depending on the time of the year. Increased farm season sometimes just limits the ability to use cover crops as a rotation because you've stretched your season so far that you really don't have time in between to grow some of these cover crops. A lot of times people use a lot of short rotations, and that can lead into an increase in residue-borne diseases. And then you get the other issue with longer rotations where you have something like tomatoes or peppers there, like indeterminate varieties that you grow almost year round. You have some to break for the winter, but this really favors soil-borne diseases. And some of the examples of this is like timber rot or white mold in tomatoes, southern blight in tomatoes, your fungal leaf spots like Sherry talked about, which are going to move back up from the soil and the residue, and something like bottom rot in lettuce, which we've seen a lot near Little Rock. And another part of that is nematodes. We know if you intensely farm an area, especially with a lot of crops that are host to nematodes, that eventually you're going to get them in the soil, and they're little plant parasites. They're going to basically cause a disease in the plant where it lowers the yield and things like that. And they're very hard to get rid of once you get them. And so you got to rotate your crops, rotating things that are not host to nematodes. And that's the only way to really slow down the progression of them in those tunnels. And get tests often. I know I mentioned the nematode lab. Every year you should be taking a soil test to the nematode lab to see where you're at. Because if you start to get some numbers built up, you need to mitigate that as quick as possible. So when we talk about crop rotation, especially in high tunnels, we're talking about rotating plant families. You want to make sure you're rotating to something that's not just a different cultivar or species. You want to get out of the plant family because many diseases and many, especially viruses or insects, are specific to a plant family. So like, here's just two examples of a rotation. Lettuce and kale, it's pretty similar, right? People eat it similarly, but these are in two completely different families. One's in the composite, and I think I put nightshade there, but that's not correct. I meant to change the solanaceous to nightshade. I'll show you the real kale family in a second. And then like peppers to tomatoes, though. Peppers and tomatoes are pretty different, but they are in the same plant species or family. And so what you'll notice is they have a lot of the same diseases. Southern blight's an issue in both of them. Some of our bacterial diseases are issues in both of them. And you want to think of the same thing for a cover crop. if you're growing beans and then you go to a legume cover crop, you're not really rotating there. You know, you're still increasing nitrogen in the soil, but you're not getting a good rotation. So here's just a chart for your, usage, just to kind of give you an idea of the different families and what's in each one of them. So you can see that if you go from growing like beet to spinach, then you're not really rotating in a true sense. You're still, a lot of disease and stuff are still going to take advantage of both of those. So this is just a good thing to keep in mind. And it's pretty easy if you have like a cover crop in mind, search on the internet, find out what its scientific name is. If you click it and go to Wikipedia, it'll tell you the plant family right on the right. And you don't need to know anything about it. You just need to compare that to whatever crop you want to grow. And if it's the same thing, then it's maybe not a great idea. Still could work. One way to kind of mitigate some of these issues, and I know I talked a lot about it's hard to diversify spots or diversify tunnels, but really what you can do is divide your tunnel into distinct areas where you're going to rotate. Think about different areas of the tunnel. Maybe plant your solanaceous crops like your tomatoes and peppers in one spot, plant some of your other like lettuces in another spot, and then change that up the next year. If you're able to do that, you're going to slow down some of these diseases. Try not to grow one plant family in a spot for more than a year. If you go through a whole year of having tomatoes in a spot, try to grow something else in that spot the next year. If you start getting bad soil-borne disease issues, this means you may need to rotate for potentially 3 years. Some of these diseases stick around for a long time. And you can try to fill the void for between production cycles with the cover crop. And so if you're putting a non-host in there, like a grass cover crop, it's a good way to mitigate some of these issues. So we know there's a lot of issues, or I mentioned cover crops a couple times, and there's a lot of benefits to it. And I'm not going to go too much into it. And I don't work too much with cover crops, but there's some really good places for you to go look. And so there's just two publications on the right there where they specifically work with cover crops in high tunnels. One is out of Minnesota, so take it with a little bit of a grain of salt because it is way farther north. You get much more sunlight in the summer, but also a much shorter season overall. And the other is from Kentucky, which is much more similar to what we have here, but even they lean on Minnesota a little bit in their stuff. But we know from cover crops what it can give you is it can break up disease cycles because diseases need specific hosts, or at least family-specific hosts a lot of times. You can break that up pretty well with using different plant families. It's going to disrupt pests like nematodes. It's always a good idea to search whether or not your cover crop is going to be able to host nematodes. It can help fix nitrogen. It can help increase organic matter if you do it correctly. It can shade out weeds as well. And then maybe some help with soil salinity depending on what you use. You need to think about. It's usually going to be fall planted, summer planted, or intercropping. When you're choosing heat tolerance, you're going to be needing varieties that are going to be able to stand a little bit more heat, especially if you're talking about something you're planting to maybe relieve some of the stress on an area. They need to be non-host for nematodes. And think about residue. I think in a field situation, people don't have to think about residue as much because you can get in equipment in and really get out a lot of the residue. But in a high tunnel, especially when you're talking about trying to go in really quickly into a crop, this is going to be an issue, especially if you grow some of the bigger cover crops like some kind of sorghum Sudan grass or something like that. It could be an issue getting the residue out. A lot of diseases can survive on those. Fungicides are going to be necessary, depending on whether or not you're organic or you're conventional. You want to think about everything I talked about just before, and then keep in mind that you're probably still going to have to use fungicides. But that's why you have multiple facets to your management plan. There is a restricted use of fungicides in high tunnel environments. Whenever people decide how safe fungicides or other pesticides are, this is based on how quickly they're breaking down in an environment. Well, this is a different environment than in a field situation. And what we've always used is if you have a closed side on your high tunnel, it's technically a greenhouse when considering whether or not a pesticide is legal for use. If the side is open, then it's technically in the field. And what you'll find is there are much more options in the field. And a lot of the pesticides that Sherry mentioned, most of those or all of them are labeled for field use in Arkansas, but only some of them are labeled for greenhouse use in Arkansas. And if you look on the right there, that's page 264 in that vegetable guide I mentioned, and that's where you can go to see what can be used in a greenhouse. That's much more specific. There's been some new rules and talks, and I don't think Arkansas is enforcing it yet, but there's been talks that they're going to start enforcing high tunnels like greenhouses, no matter if the sides are closed or not. And so I would potentially look more into that. And I've asked the Arkansas Plant Board, and they told me the side is still what we're looking at. But whenever I go to national meetings, they talk more about how almost everything's being considered a greenhouse now. So just keep that in mind as you're looking forward when thinking about fungicides. But just to reiterate, when you're talking about disease or any other kind of control in high tunnels, maximize your cultural controls. Place your tunnel in an ideal location. Start off with a rotation of different plant families, especially when you think about your market sources. Maximize your airflow, integrate cover crops when possible, use resistant varieties where possible, utilize clean seed and transplants, understand which diseases could be a problem going in, and so that's going to help you a lot to know what to look for. Try to remove residue between crops, remove diseased plants. If you see a plant that is diseased, get it out, get the roots out with it. That's very important. A lot of them can move through the drip lines like southern blight can. And use preventative fungicides when possible. If you know you have a risk of a disease and you can use them, then that's going to be a key to lowering the amount of disease in your high tunnel. I believe Karen asked me to talk about, just specific consideration for winter vegetables or whatever you're going for in the winter. So these are just a few things to think about more specifically. If you're coming out of another crop in the fall and you're trying to go into winter vegetables, try to make sure you go in these clean, remove all your previous residue. Don't just rush them in to try to get a crop in. You want to make sure you're going into it clean. Continue your rotation. If you already were growing vegetables or like some kind of leafy vegetable, don't go to another one immediately. And maybe just consider going to different locations in your tunnel. Look for varieties that are resistant when possible. Downy mildew is a big issue, and if you can get a variety that's resistant in lettuce or spinach, which does exist, and you have this issue, then definitely look for that as an option. Try to ventilate, no matter if it's cold or not. You want to be able to ventilate even on cold days because it's going to be very important to try to reduce some of this humidity to try to maximize air movement. And make sure to use row covers when it's possible or when it's time to, because if you can keep your crops healthier by reducing cold injury, then you're going to decrease your disease load. Row covers can definitely increase humidity and disease, though. It increases your risk of that because you're creating a more compact environment where condensation is going to get trapped. But you can remove these during the sunnier portions of the day to help release some of that humidity within. And then now the last thing I'm going to talk about is just a quick note about insects. Everything I talked about basically applies to insects. All the orientation, all the resistant varieties, cultural controls, they all apply to insects the same as diseases. But in high tunnels, you're going to have a mixture between greenhouse issues and field issues. You're still going to have a lot of your field issues, but you're going to promote some of these pests that are issues in greenhouses. And some of these are going to be things like mites. So spider mites, broad mites, and russet mites. These pests like environments where you're getting less rainfall and high heat. And so it's going to be a lot more like some of the subtropical environments or arid environments. But even though you have all the humidity, it's still going to be more amenable to them. So spider mites are always going to be an issue in a greenhouse. And you need to always be out. Scouting for them. And when you find them, you need to react very quickly. Aphids are almost always going to be an issue within high tunnels. And these are going to spread many of the viruses that Sherry was talking about, like not tomato spotted wilt virus, but some of the tobacco ring spot viruses and things like that. But they can, even if they're not the main host, they can even spread to some degree other viruses. And every high tunnel I've been in with tomatoes in the winter, they've had issues with tomatoes or with aphids. I always walk in and find a bunch of aphids. Whiteflies, thrips, these are two of the biggest pests in high tunnels. But also you see things like scale insects and hoppers. These are all kind of your greenhouse typical issues. Whiteflies can be a big issue just on plant health in general. Thrips are going to bring in a lot of disease. And those are the ones that are going to transmit that tomato spotted wilt virus. And weed control is going to be very important because these are going to act as a reservoir for many of these tunnel pests. And so when you're moving from crop to crop, if you can eliminate most of the plants that are in there and get them out and practice good sanitation, a lot of times you can minimize a lot of these insect issues. But just for limiting issues from these pests, use virus-resistant varieties when possible. Very important for thrips and aphids. Practice good weed control. This is going to reduce your risk from mites and other pests like thrips. Remove the residue and allow some time between crops, and scout. Scouting is very important for insect control. It's less important, disease control, it's always good, or management, it's always good to get out and look, but for insects, you can usually catch an issue and then try to manage it as it's happening. With diseases, it's much harder. But insects, you have a little bit more leeway and you can get out and scout. As soon as you bring in plants, you need to be scouting those plants as they come in. Because a lot of times they come in with thrips issues, they come in with scale insects, they come in with aphids on them. And so if you can find that and maybe get on top of it earlier, you can mitigate some issues. It also allows for the potential use of biological control. So if you recognize there's an issue, then you can come in earlier with a biological control agent like a predatory mite or maybe a parasitic wasp. But if you have a raging issue, you almost never can use biological control. You almost always have to use chemical control to combat it. But also be quick to react with your appropriate insecticides or miticides because, they can really take over. And, this is my last slide here, but this is tomatoes in a high tunnel where, plants were completely webbed from all the mites that were on it. And that's because they weren't responding with miticides quick enough. But that's all I got. I hope I didn't go too far over time. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
No problem, Aaron. We appreciate you. I want to apologize to you, Aaron, because I introduced you as Aaron Cato, as Aaron Cole,
yeah,
because that was on the program. And I did not realize you were Aaron Cato until you were like, "Are you talking about me?"
Yeah. You just read the wrong thing. That's no worry
at all. I was just going by what I was reading. If you got any comments, let's see, right now there's nothing in the chat box. I'll go and look at the chat box. Russell Bean had put some comments in there. Some of the things that cause the problems in the hoop house. And you need to have a risk management plan, all those other kind of things. Mm-hmm. Aaron, you said something about transplants bringing in problems. Again, back to this hemp thing. Here in Arkansas, we started growing hemp last year. I guess everybody did. And then again this year. And we were using transplants. Mm-hmm. This year, one of the producers lost almost all of his plants before he even got them to the field. So that's telling me he got some plants that already had issues. This year, the year coming up, next year, we're looking at producing seeds and producing from a seed instead of from a transplant. And hopefully that will avoid some of our problems right there.
Yeah.
But if you got any comments or questions for Aaron Cato, just put them in the chat box.
Yeah, and I've heard the caveat out, the sex of your biggest issues in production, and there is a lot of work. I don't know if you're growing organic or not, but there's a lot of work of trying to get some fungicides for some of these issues in hemp, at the national level through the IR4 program. And so there is a lot of people that are, extension specialists in the Southeast that are aware and trying to do their best to find some kind of mitigation effort, especially for, we talked about mold on your hemp. There's a lot of people getting Miticides gray mold in their hemp, and there's just not any option right now for them. But there's a lot of work going into finding something for you guys.
All right, thanks for the information. Next on our program, we have Jan Park, who's a UAPB extension specialist. Jan, are you ready?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so the arrow, okay. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see.
All right. So I can start, right?
Yes, you can.
All right. So actually, is a little bit different. And the previous speakers talking about the high tunnel is management, and this is part of a management, but it's not really not that way. That is, I'm talking about the pollinations, and especially I focus on the pollinators. And this one is I'm going to share the little bit of the basic, what kind of pollinators available in our area, and what is possibility, and how you can prepare the pollinators. But in general, when I looked at the some kind of high tonal crops and vegetables, and a lot of vegetables, I'm going to talk about this in a little bit later. And the first of all, I want to share about the importance of the pollinators. And everybody knows, and pollination is the like a transfer pollen grains from the anther and the stigma, and the certain period during the blooming. That time, if you have the lack of the pollinators available in our field, maybe that you have the yield maybe not that great. And that is another view, is more than 85% of our flowering plants in the globally and require the any kind of animal, and mostly insects, to move the pollens. And that is kind of fuzzy guys, and that is a kind of a honeybees covered by the pollens. And always taking picture is, we need some kind of a dramatic picture. So this is not really happen all the time, but sometimes it happen. Okay. And there is a lot of groups of the pollinators available in our field during the regular seasons. And the first piece and bees, and that is a fly, and the hummingbird, sphinx, butterflies. Those are all have the available in our field. And this is a map of the where pollinators available. It's technically everywhere, right? And if you look at this, bees and or the pollinators are important for the to everyone, and they have a lot of a list of the trees and the crops and the seed productions. And I just made it the in the high tunnel. And we don't use the high tunnel for apples, apricots, and these pears and plums. And but we use strawberries and lettuce and mustard, and we use as okra and cucumbers and zucchini squash and eggplants and cantaloupes and something like that. But depends on the seasons. And the certain area is like strawberries. Sometimes they just in making the high tunnel in the November and December, and so they just harvesting it like it's like a February early seasons. So they just increase the income, something like that. But the lettuce or the mustard and the kales or the onions and those kind of broccolis, those are the they don't need the pollinators in high tunnel, because they are not focused on the flowering. They just before the blooming, they just harvest their crops. So that is the another the consideration. What kind of crops you want to focus on, and you can have the plan ahead. So I'm going to talk about how you can prepare the pollinators in your the high tunnel, something like that. And that is during the regular seasons. And they just like this is a kind of what is that, the pepper, but that is what is that, the mint species family. And whenever they blooming and the bumblebees come or the honeybees comes, that is no problems. But and if you don't have the you are not providing good shelter for the pollinators in your field, even during the summertime and fall or spring, and you may not have enough pollinators available in your field. And for example, and there is two different types of the pollinators. And first of all, we can the caroline is a is divided to the two groups. One is the generalist, and the other one is a specialist. Generalist, and that pollinators visiting every different types of no matter what they are, it's a flowers, and they go. And specialist, they are very specific, the plants and the focused on. So this one is a shelter for the specialist, like a native bees. Native bees are technically, most time the specialist, and they have the ground nesting pollinators, and they have the wood nesting pollinators, and they are solitaries. And the cavity, the nesting pollinators, there's a social species, such as, like bumblebees, or some other wasp, or some other yellow jackets, and those are kind of stuff. But I'm going to talk about the wood nesting, the pollinators. They are solitary, and solitary means, and they are not is gathering together, and they just each, the pollinators are female, the queen, and they are collecting the nectar, and they deposit eggs, and they just die out for the next season. Okay. And first of all, you need the providing good habitats for the pollinators. Other than that, Europe is a native pollinators, the population is going to declining. And so that is general things, and you have to know the habitats in our the farmland, and more than 30% of natural vegetations required. And that is, if you put in the certain non-native plants, and you will attract in general generalists, such as the honeybees. And but they are not, it's like a native bees are not interested in non the native plants. Actually, they are looking for native plants, and they protect, if we protect the flowering plants and insecticides, and is optimized, is maintained more than 85% cover like this picture, and that is a perfect for the native, the pollinators. And we have the lot of challenge. We need a lot of pesticides to maintain, kind of the pest insects, and especially high tunnel. They have a lot of, it's like Aaron mentioned, that they have the whiteflies and the thrips, and then there is many, the insects, and not the insects, that's a thrip. Yeah, that's just the insects. And but sometimes you have the problem of mites. So or the fungicide is a fungus problems. So you use many different types of pesticides controlled, and it's maintained on the threshold of the disease in your field. But we are living in the Arkansas, so in Arkansas case, and a lot of people say the Arkansas is every year have a different situation. So consider time of applications, so that to protect your pollinators in your field. So that is the basic rules for the pollinators, and they need a lot of the native plants around your the field. And so before you are making the high tunnel, I'm going to talk about a little bit later, and how you prepare the native bees for your high tunnels. But before you getting bees collecting, and you need lots of native plants around surrounding your field. And perennial is good, because you don't have to worry about, they are just coming back, it's every year. So, and the shrub types is okay, and then further successions. And sometimes certain area it's always spring, they have it's covered by the flowers, and that's it, and there is nothing flowering. That is not the successful for the pollinators. And we need the continuous the flowering bed, and the weedy lawn is good, because weedy is sometimes I don't want to weed growing around our field, but that is after they grow and they have a lot of a long straw they left behind. That straw is providing perfect the nest site for the native bees. And the minimized trees, and a lot of people thinking, oh, I have lots of trees surrounding my field, and that is not helpful for the pollinators. And because the trees, if you have the lots of big trees, especially the like oak tree or the maple trees, they are excellent, the pollen, provider during the springtime. But after that, that's it. They don't have a flowering. They just creating the shady area, and actually they as kind of minimize, flowering bed. Also, the vulnerable shrubs and the flowers in woodlands. That is some people just cut it out, the shrubs or the small things, and because sometimes they have the possible another mites problems, and chiggers and something like that. But the vulnerable shrubs and the flowers in woodlands, that is required for the nest site for you know the native bees. And think about this: more species of plants means you can get more species of pollinators in your field. So think about those, and that is a common principle. More plants, different types of species, have more different species of pollinators available in your field. And there is anti-pollinator planting and big box of flowers. Okay, and I want to maximize my field, so I can have like a giant, kind of a raised bed for the flowers. And think about this. This is not for it. Looks good and maybe looks okay for the bees or pollinators, but actually this is a kind of a good example. If you travel by the airplane and during the night you see the look at the underneath through the window, what you see, and black, and sometimes you're passing over the kind of a small city, and here is a lights there, and then another lights is a kind of apart. And but if you get over the big city, what you see, the cover by the the lights, and insects when they fly, and they can see the big box flowers like a small city, lights in here and there, and they are not interested. They are looking for big city, okay? And that is the you have to think about. And perfect loan is is good for me, but not good for the pollinators. And that is a kind of a digester, and that is just so clean, and they need a kind of a dirty loan. It's like a growing many things. And so the previously talked a long time ago, I talking about, and when you have like the field, just sacrifice about the 20% lands for the native bees, and just set aside there one corner and just leave it alone, and that is perfect nesting site and habitats. And the large mound area is not good, and tree with the understory removed, that is not good. They are just removing, you are removing the nest place. And concrete structure, and looks clean and nice and easy to handle, and but that is disastrous at the habitats. All right, so, and you look at the sometimes they have a small holes on the twigs, and you can see the they are in and out. Actually they are not living here. They are actually making the brood, and there is a deposit eggs. They're collecting the pollens and nectar there, and then they making the nice small chambers for her egg. So they, after they finish it, they die out and they seal the those. And sometimes you can making this nice, and the different types size of a bamboo sticks, and you making the different size of drills of the wood blocks that is about at least 12 inches long, and you can making the both sides like you drill at least like the about the 10 inches deep, and that is it's good for the the is like what's a cavity site, the pollinators nest site. And that is, if you're making like this, don't expect you will have the pollinators same year. Sometimes they required and 1 or 2 years to recognize, oh, there is it's a good location for the nest site. So you need to be patient, and you just whenever you just have that, and you feel the with you how they are occupied by pollinators. you will see after they finish the deposit eggs, they're going to seal that entrance by the mud. So whenever you see the mud, feel it, and you expecting there is the babies inside, all right? And don't leave it that's a field. Problem is, if you leave it there, and sometimes it's okay, but most time the ants or the other insects, they come and they consume their eggs, all right? And because inside, not only eggs, they have when the larva is growing, and they're going to feed them, kill them and eat it, and then they have leftover the pollen there. So they have still, you have to take it out and secure it in the shade area until you need in your high tunnels. So, and mow once a year or every other year, and keep invasives in check, and herbs and simple non-natives attract the generalist, and that's the honeybees. That's why I'm going to talk about the honeybees a little bit, and the native plants and native insects, and that is always the kind of proportional. And so I'm talking about this is the honeybees. Why I'm going to talk about honeybees. It's technically easy to handle for the high tunnel, and if you're interested in, it's if you have planting the cucumbers, zucchini, squash, okra, or the eggplants, or cantaloupes, or some other strawberries, and maybe, and that is easy to handle, all right? So I'm going to talk about a little bit there's the role of the worker bees, and they have a three different caste system: nursing bees and guard bees and foragers. And actually, for the high tunnel, we need the foragers, not guard bees. Guard bees is kind of their guard. They're is making the orientation flights. That means they are technically a little bit aggressive, and whenever they got the sting, try to sting you, and most time almost 75% above, that's the guard bees. Nursing bees, they are not come out from the nest. They are the cell cleaning and brood incubation and the feeding older larvae and the feeding young larvae, and that is nursing bees. That is about the 7 to 10 days old from the adult, and then after that they become the guard bees. So this one is going to be a nursing bees and guard bees. And foragers are different groups. No, that's the nursing bees. That is a young bees, and after they have like a two to 3 weeks, they become the guard bees. After that, a month later, they become the foragers. So when we managing the foragers, and we can bring into the high tunnel. So I'm going to talk about a little bit, it's a little bit later, and think about why the honeybees are so easy, because they contains at least 52 to 60,000 bees. So we have a lot of the bees, and why the one bees can visit at least 1.2 million flowers for lifetime. Okay, so if you have like a less than the two, is about 1 million flowers, okay, and you just need like a 1-2 bees, and she can handle those. But thing is, and there is a kind of a trickies in high tunnels, because high is the major difference is the difficulty of honeybees. Honeybees are oriented by the UV light. So the honeybee is a high tunnels covered by the vinyl stuff. And actually honeybees are attracted to the, going to up. They are not interested downward. They're going fly to upward, and they is kind of banging the, surface of the vinyl on the top. And then eventually, they die out. And the thing is, we bring in the certain number of the bees, and about the 10% somehow they recognize, there is they can just go to the flowers in one by one, and that is enough, power force to the pollinating your crops. And the queen bees capable of laying eggs 0 to 1,500 eggs per day. If you read the book, always they say the queen bees can the laying eggs and more than 1,500 eggs per day. No, that's not true. that is only able to early springtime and it's early summertime, she able to deposit eggs at least 1,500 eggs per day. But after that, they slowing down. And certain points, she quit laying eggs, like a zero eggs per day. All right. So that is another challenge. And several hundred drones and the worker, we don't need the drone bees because that's male bees. They never visiting the flowers. They are waiting. They stay in the nest. They consume their honey there. And we need the worker bees like a stroll, the females, which is the like a foragers. All right, and that is that's the stage of life cycles, and that is not important for the high tunnels, but you just understand what's going on. Worker bees from eggs to adult require the 21 days, and queen bees is 16 days, and the drone bees 24 days. And if you look at the winter bees, they can survive 6 months in the hives. This is not India. If we bring into the high tunnel, they are behave like a summer bees, and they are not going to live like a 6 month, because 6 month means they stay inside the nest. They are not flying out. They just stay inside. That's why their longevity is a lifespan is much longer than there's a back and forth that they're flying continuously. So they just require like only 6 weeks. All right. So this is high tunnel, and this is strawberry the farms. They have the this kind of a high tunnel. I just visiting the one this high tunnel strawberry farms. They have about 100 of this. Actually, this is one row is about the let's say it was 100 meters. So it's about the what is that? Kind of the length of the football field from the touchdown to the other side, the touchdown zone. That's very long. Okay, that is they have the 100 size of these high tunnels, and that is a wow. That is incredible. And they just put the beehives like this. All right. The thing is, this is a challenge. And if you want to plant like this hives in your high tunnels, you have to talk about the beekeepers and willing to do it, and you have to talk about them, and that plans is at least a 6 month behind, so that the beekeepers can prepare, and that is way. What they do, they put the queen bee here, and they bring the what is that, the worker bees, and about the 8 frames full of the bees into it, and leave it there. And then every month they replace bees from these hives. And the thing is, it just the strawberries that they blooming is about the 3 weeks, something like that. So actually, this is a one-time treatment. Okay, if you put the one-time the beehives like this, and that is covered the old. So you have to think about what kind of crop you're going to plant in your hive, in the high tunnels, and you have to think about what the blooming period. If the blooming period is like a 1 week or 2 weeks or the 1 month or 2 month, and you have to talk about communicate with the beekeeper and what you planted, how long they need bees in their high tunnels. All right, so that is the beekeepers can prepare the specific beehives for the high tunnels. All right, so that is that was a very fascinating. And a lot is that they are the kind of a settle down about the 1 weeks, and majority bees survived. Many bees are died because they are just they cannot find the decent direction to go where they go. And insects characteristic is their anti-gravity behavior, and most time they just fly, go up. They are never rarely go down. Okay, so actually they going up and they looking for it, and then they found the strawberry flowers there, and then they going down. But the problem is that is covered by the vinyls, and actually they are just trying to going up all the time. So, but the good thing is 10% guys is ladies and figured it out. whole, and they just coming down, and they are the pollinating in crops. So that is the challenge, and that's why a lot of the high tonal farmers, they purchasing the native bees from online, but that is kind of challenging, all right. And sometimes they are not, the time matter. Sometimes they are not emerging, to emerge to adults on time. They are not emerge on time, and so, and that is the honeybees. The strategies is maybe is good. And I mentioned that this high tunnel is about the hundreds of high tunnels. That is a really actually research focus on the high tunnels. But you have the maybe 4 or 5 high tunnels, and that is manageable by the beekeepers. Like I set up like a 4 or 5, that the one box, small hives, and to the field, so that that is the for the pollinations. So that is another pictures, and that is how they set it up. And they just making like this pipe site, and actually it didn't show up because sometimes they just cover by the either like a double tapes or some other they the what I say, using the butter, and so that the other insects cannot crawl up. So that is another challenge there. So any questions? That is my talk. If you have further questions, just let me know, and I can talk about more. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Park. Any questions? Just again, put them in the chat box, and we'll get them addressed. There's Park's information just popped up there on the screen. So next we have Lavelle. Yes, we have Lavelle Foote, who's a retired NRCS conservationist. Lavelle, are you ready?
Yes, I'm
Okay.
trying to get my presentation ready there.
All right.
Okay, yeah, can everyone see it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, good afternoon. I'm Lavelle Foote. I'm a UAPB small farm consultant, retired district conservationist with NRCS. And this has really been great because everything we've heard so far from Sean from Sherry, from Aaron to Jan, there are conservation practices out here to help assist you with the high tunnel system, to help pay for each and every one of the practices that can do exactly what they've been talking about here throughout the program. And some of the things that are available, one thing I'd like to say to you, the UAPB Small Farm Program has conservation technical assistance available to help you with some of this. Because through the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, NRCS can help you with this high tunnel system that we're talking about here today. Some of the things they can do, they can come to your farm and provide direct farmers assistance from eligibility, for an entity, a person, program eligibility, sign up, conservation planning, technical consultation, and implementation of the conservation practices. And mainly, we're talking about the Environmental Quality Incentive Program. The Environmental Quality Incentive Program would be a very important program within NRCS that you really need to consider if you're considering a high tunnel system. This program is a program that pays cost share assistance to help purchase and install the high tunnel system, as well as many of the practices that Sean and Sherry and Aaron and Yana spoke about earlier. And one of the things the extension associates and consultants can do with the small farm program can help you put together that application. Fill out that form 1200 for the EQIP program. It's important that you file an application before the deadlines. EQIP is a continuous sign-up program. However, Arkansas right now has not been announced, but in sitting in on a state technical committee last week, they announced that the sign-up deadline for Arkansas for the 2021 crop year will be December the 18th of 2020 to sign up for EQIP. Each year they have a ranking period. And if you don't sign up by that deadline, your application will not be considered for funding until the next coming year. The consultant can also help you fill out your AGI form, your adjusted gross income form. Help you complete 20. They can also number in order to a program, Senate program, you must farm number. And if you're having the problems obtaining that number, one of the consultants, myself, or someone on Dr. English staff can help you obtain that number. Also, if you, once you get a contract and maybe you're having a problem working out according to the terms of the agreement, we can serve as an intermediate, also working with that field office or the state office, helping solve some of your problems there. Now, we've been talking about conservation, high tunnel systems. And if you're gonna talk about high tunnel systems, when it comes to NRCS, they don't use just the word high tunnels. They always use the word conservation systems. And it's really been great to sit here on this particular workshop because all we've heard all morning is about a conservation system. Work through, whether it was Sean or Aaron, or in this case, see here. And of course, we don't have to tell you what a high tunnel is. It's, you know, the main thing, it extends the growing season, it improves plant quality, it improves soil quality, it also improves water quality. And NRCS, they have it up under the practice code 325. And this high tunnel can be paid on under the EQIP program at a rate if you're not a, what we call a historic underserved participant, at a rate of 75% of the average cost. Now in Arkansas, the average cost is based on the actual cost that Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana come up with, and they take 75% of that cost for a person that is not a historic underserved person. And then if you are a historic underserved person, they pay up to 90% of the average cost to install a high tunnel. All right. It's important to note that in putting a high tunnel in Arkansas, if you're designing one for heavy snow loads, you must put in a Gothic design. Is the only one they allow. It's important that the distance between each cross rib cannot exceed more than 4 feet, and that the metal cannot be less than 14 gauge, more than 14 gauge metal on the cross ribs. Let's see. Okay, sustainable conservation system. I was asked to speak about structure practices. When we talk about structure practice with a high tunnel system with NRCS, and each and every one of these practices will receive cost share assistance upon to work within your system. Of course, there's the high tone. They pay up on the high tone, which is practice code 325. Another practice you may not think about, but if you got some type of erosion occurring out there and you got some kind of gully around the site where you're going to install that high tone, you may need what we call a grade stabilization structure. And if you're going to do any type of irrigation and you have a watering system, if you look down, you'll see things like a water well, practice code 642. And in order to get the water well, you also need to get a pumping plant, which is the motor that goes into the water well. NRCS do the water well in two separate components, one being the casing for the well, and then the motor and the pumping plant that goes into it. And then if you're going to need the pumping plant in the well, you might even need what we call an underground irrigation pipeline to get the water over to the high tunnel. The next thing you might need is a structure for water control. And I know a lot of these names and a lot of these codes may not mean much to you, but when we speak of a structure for water control, it could be simply just a cover or a drain pipe. It may be something needed to get in and out of the field, across a ditch or a stream or whatever the case may be to get to your high tunnel. But at the same time, if you're going to put another structure for water control, may also be a flow meter on that well, so you can determine the amount of water being produced by that well. And you might even need a field ditch to drain the water away from that high tunnel system. These are all structural practices that you can get cost share assistance through the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, through the EQIP program, through the Natural Resource Conservation Service. Okay. Well, you got all of those practices. What else might you need? You may need some supporting practice. It may be management practices, activities. You heard Sean talk earlier, and I also heard Aaron talk about cover crops. NRCS pays on cover crops, crop rotation. Critical area planting would be another practice if you have some erosion or you can't stabilize some type of area around the high tunnel system on the land. You may have to do some critical area planting. You may also grow the crops in the high tunnel in residue, but according to Aaron, that could be a pest problem. So you might want to stay away from that one. But if you decide to grow it in there, that is a practice that they also pay on practice code 345. We heard also, as Sean was speaking, he was speaking about that if you're going to do a drip irrigation or micro irrigation system, that you needed to test the water. Under the EQIP program, they pay up to 3 times in a contract that you can get the water tested through EQIP, and they pay the total cost from what I've seen. A total water sample can be paid up under the EQIP program under practice code 355. We just got through listening to Jan a few moments ago, speaking about pollinators. You might want to consider putting in a field border and put that field border in and plant those types of plants that would help from a pollination standpoint. Is another practice you might want to consider. Irrigation water management, again, you heard Sean mention earlier in his presentation. Another practice you might want to consider in your high tunnel system would be mulching. And when you think of mulching, you think about maybe straw or something being screwed out. Yes, that can be one of them. But in an NRCS system, that mulching can also be the black synthetic plastic that you're placing within the high tunnel. They pay also on it, and you can get that payment for 3 years. Of course, nutrient management. In any system that you're growing any type of environment, you need to be testing the soils, and you need to be considering the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and also the micronutrients that's going into that particular system. So definitely nutrient management is another one. And of course, here's Aaron and Sharon, your pest management. They also pay cost share assistance on pest management that you can also get help and assistance from. Here I got a few pictures of, you can see the 325 is just a high tunnel system where a person has 3 up on its farm. In the system of the EQIP program, you cannot get 3 high tunnels if you're getting a maximum land of 4,000 square feet in Arkansas in the same year. However, you can come back the next year and apply for another high tunnel. But you can get at least up there, if they're 40 feet wide, 100 feet long, that's 4,000 square feet, you can get at least 1 high tunnel a year if you get eligible to be accepted for funding. The key to it is you must put in a conservation system. Just going in essence for a high tone probably will not get you accepted into the program to get funding for high tone. All of these things that Sean, Aaron, Sherry, and Jan have talked about, doing those types of practice that I just went over will probably get you accepted into the program. Here, as you notice on the next picture, we have a micro irrigation grip tape system. Again, the micro irrigation is paid up on the equip for cost share. I spoke earlier about the mulching, the synthetic black plastic. They will pay on the synthetic black plastic on the high tone system. And of course, a irrigation well and pumping plant. They will pay and pay assistance to help install the practice for a irrigation pump and well casing. The micro system might include the grip tape. It might include the drip irrigation with supply lines, or it may be the pump distribution manifold, the well pumping system itself. And we heard earlier from Aaron that you can even get a solid state sprinkler system on that micro system. May not be diseases though with this one. Sean mentioned earlier the type put these big tractor trucks and all the big fertilized buggies inside the high tone, but it's still very important you to consider that nutrient management, because with that micro system, you're able to feed your nutrients right through the grip system. But it's still very important that you get out there and take that soil sample and make sure you apply your nutrients according to your soil sample. I stuck this in here with residue management, but after listening to Aaron, this may not be a good idea because of pest issues. Cover crops are still a biggie for us for soil health and water management and pest management as well. So again, that NRCS do pay and can get assistance install this practice also. And Stephen, I know we're running behind a little bit. Again, my name is Lavelle Foots. I'm a UAPB small farm consultant. You can reach me at my number 870-692-7535. I will be happy to come to your farm and help with your UCUP application and also help you put together those conservation practices that you're interested in and completing your system. The most important thing to remember for this year, it looked like, that the deadline to make application is December the 18th of 2020 in order to qualify for the 2021 crop year. And if they have any questions, Stephen, I'll be happy to answer.
All right, thanks, Lavelle. Let's see what's in the chat box. Does it matter what type of crop you plant in high tunnel when you're planting through equip?
No, as long as you're planted into the soil, any crop can be planted as long as it's legal. Even hemp can be planted into a high tunnel system. As long as it meets all other USDA rules and regulations, you can even plant hemp in a high tunnel system.
Okay, all right. Again, yeah, we have run out of time on this presentation. I was supposed to be talking about equipment and marketing. And when I was first asked about talking about equipment, I wasn't thinking high tunnel. I was thinking just regular equipment maintenance on the farm because we were harvesting soybeans at the time. So I'm thinking about maintaining your combine and maintaining the grain cart. And I took some pictures of some problems with the grain cart, some problems with the combine and other things. But with the high tunnel, there's a lot of hose, rakes, and shovels. And maybe a tiller, a walk-behind tiller. Maybe some small tractors. Those small tractors, just routine maintenance on the tractor, check your oil, grease things. Rotary tillers have grease fittings on them. Tractors, you check your oil, check your transmission, check your belts and hoses and air filters, oil filters, things of that nature. And even with your irrigation systems, I guess you always want to check to make sure your valves aren't leaking and they're still connected, things like that with the micro irrigation and drip line. And on a marketing thing, you know, the main thing with marketing when you're growing vegetables, you really need to establish a market before you plant that crop. Because many times we get people come here to our program and ask us where can they sell some peas, where can they sell some squash, where can they sell some okra. And they got it outside in the truck. So they did not come and ask us or help us work with them on establishing a market before they plant the crop. And now a lot of times either you sell it or smell it, and they end up smelling it. We don't want that to happen. Of course, you know, you got your farmers markets. You can do a roadside stand. You can do consumer direct and things of that nature. And if you want to do a retailer, nowadays, you're going to need to get your GAP certified. General agriculture practices is an inspection. It has to do with how you handle the product and how safe you are on your farm and handling the product from start to finish, mainly in harvesting and from harvesting to a packing plant or to a customer. I see I got a question here in the chat box or a comment. Does the high tone have light depth? They're Courtney. Have light depth. Lavelle, can you help me with this question about the high tone and light? In the chat box, does the high toner have light depth?
Light depth? What do we mean by light depth?
I'm not sure. What do we mean by light depth? That's what's throwing me off right there. Hold up, here we come. We might have something. No, that's another question.
I don't know who question.
Oh, I got another question about the pros and cons of using a high toner over a greenhouse.
Okay, with the pros and cons of using a high tone over a greenhouse is used to grow crops not into the soil for the most part. NRCS will not pay on a greenhouse. However, they will pay on the high tone to help install that high tone system. But that is the main thing on that. You're allowed to put heating and those types of things in it. I don't know if they meant by light depth, did they mean by installing some type of lighting system, or what were they really referring to that one, Steph?
Okay. There's another comment in the chat box about navigating your way through the NICS equipped cost share system, and some websites that you can, there's some websites there that you can go to. Russell Bean put those in there. He works over it with the Tuskegee and the small farm program over there. And he's been adding a lot to today's conference. So we're running out of time. We went over our time, actually. Light degeneration, degradation. Okay. That's what we're trying to talk about when that question. Light degradation.
In other words, he's getting too much light through the plastic. He's speaking in terms of through the high tone.
Yeah. So that would be like a shade cover.
Yes. And I would think Aaron or Sherry may be able to answer that better than we could, really, on that particular one.
I'm not sure exactly what they're asking, but they're talking about like getting not enough light for their growth. I think that'd be more of a production issue. You know, a lot of times you're using shade cloth to decrease it. So I think at a baseline, just using a normal high tunnel plastic screen, you're going to have enough light. You're not going to have too little anyways, but you can get too much shade in there potentially. I think Sean would probably be better to answer that, to be honest.
Yeah, somebody mentioned, you know, you don't want them too close to trees, and you really don't want your high tunnels too close to one another, because one could throw shade on another one, depending on how you have them sitting. Yeah. So the last thing I was going to mention was about the GAP certification. If you're trying to market to like restaurants, even to grocery stores or things like that, nowadays most retailers are going to require you to have be GAP certified. You have to do that through the USDA. They have a process. You have to put your application in, and then the auditor comes to your farm, and they will actually inspect your farm and audit your farm during harvest time. And they will talk to the workers without you being involved in that conversation, because you have to train your workers on good hygiene and practices on handling this. That's what a lot of what it has to do with is you have to develop a food safety for your farm. If the inspector gets there and you don't have a food safety manual, then you fail the audit. You still have to pay, but you will not get a GAP certification. Okay, but just the main marketing issue is have a market for any product you plant before you plant it, so you won't end up being stuck with it. With that, I'm pretty much going to say thank you for your participation. Thank all the presenters for taking the time out today to share the information that you've given to us. We want to thank everybody who had questions and comments, to put them in the chat box and discuss them with us today.